Well, I think we can get started, and we'll kick it off by having Laura Waxman do some introductory comments. Laura is the Director of Public Safety at the U.S. Conference of Mayors. Laura, the Zoom is yours.
Thank you, Rose. Hello, everyone, and happy Halloween. Our CEO and Executive Director, Tom Cochran, had planned to be with us today, but unfortunately something came up, and he's asked my colleague David Burns and I to represent him here. Thank you for joining us for this important E311 briefing session on the new cybersecurity grant program. The Conference of Mayors is grateful to Mike Bloomberg and Jim Anderson and our other good friends at Bloomberg Philanthropies for their partnership with us in this E311 series. Joining us today from Bloomberg are Rose Gill, Adam Freed, and Jamie Lavin. Through the E311 initiative, advice and technical assistance are available to mayors and city officials on how to access and effectively use critical federal funds available to our cities, including the Cybersecurity Grant Program. We also want to thank officials at CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency at the Department of Homeland Security, for their partnership and help over the years, and for being with us here today to brief us on, and all of you, on this new grant program. We all know that cyber attacks are a serious threat to our nation, to the public and private sectors, to our residents, and to our city governments. Many cities have been subjected to cyber attacks, and a little later, we'll hear from the mayor of one of those cities, Kathy Sheehan of Albany. Mayor Sheehan will brief us on what happened, how her city government recovered from the attack, and what they have learned from the process. The new cybersecurity grant program, which was established and funded through the bipartisan infrastructure law passed just 1 year ago, can help cities strengthen their cybersecurity protocols to prevent cyber attacks from occurring and know how best to respond to them and minimize the damage when they do occur. So let's get on with today's briefing, which comes on the last day of National Cybersecurity Month. And let me turn it over to Adam Freed of Bloomberg Philanthropies.
Thank you so much, Laura, and I'm so thrilled we were able to squeeze this in before the month closed out. My name is Adam Freed. I'm a principal here at Bloomberg Associates, and I'm really thrilled to welcome you to today's Bloomberg Federal Assistance E311 webinar on Cybersecurity Funding and Solutions. A few housekeeping items before we begin. Please feel free to introduce yourself, as many of you already have, in the chat function, including your city and role, so we can all get a sense of who's on the call. We also ask that you keep your cameras on if possible, so we can make this as interactive a session as possible. At the same time, though, please mute yourself unless you are speaking, so we don't get the unwanted background noise and drown out our speakers. Throughout the program, you can use the chat function to share thoughts and ask questions of the panelists. We'll be collecting all of these for use during the Q&A portion of our panel. And at that Q&A portion, we also will ask you to unmute yourself if you're able to ask your question if it's been posted in the chat. Finally, our number one question we always get asked, all resources that we share today, both on screen, in the discussion, or via the chat, will be sent to you after the session and posted online at our E311 website. And we'll post a chat to that website in the chat as well. As Laura mentioned, today's session is part of an ongoing partnership between Bloomberg Philanthropies and the U.S. Conference of Mayors to help cities navigate and retain the unprecedented amount of funding made available to cities from the CARES, ARPA, IIJA, and IRA. In total, these programs have contain almost $6 trillion in funding, a large portion of which is directed to cities and local governments. In turn, I'd also like to recognize and thank Laura Waxman, Dave Gatton, Dave Burns, and Tom Cochran from the conference for their ongoing partnership and support. As Laura mentioned, through our program, cities have been able to ask national experts questions about the federal funding sources available to them to respond to and recover from COVID-19 and to invest in infrastructure. In the past 2 years, we've provided detailed answers to over 400 questions from cities, all of which are posted on our website for all cities to access. We've hosted more than 24 content workshops like the one today to address pressing issues related to federal funding. And you can see on our website, they've included grant writing and management, strategies to boost municipal workforce capacity, how to leverage federal funding for resilience projects, and how to work with non-governmental partners, just to name a few. In total, more than 6,000 municipal staff from 1,400 cities have engaged with the E311 program, which is part of the local infrastructure hub that we kicked off in July. All of the materials from the hub and the E311 program, including notices on upcoming events and funding opportunities, can be found on the website that is placed in the chat. I'm now thrilled to turn over the program to my colleague, Rose Gill. Rose is a principal for municipal integrity at Bloomberg Associates. As a federal prosecutor in New York, and then as commissioner of the New York City Department of Investigations for 12 years, Rose has worked on cybersecurity in a variety of different roles. Rose, I'll turn the Zoom over to you.
Adam, thank you so much. And I am very excited to introduce this panel of subject matter experts who will be walking us through this deeply important topic and the funding opportunities that are available. And we'll begin with Trent Frazier. Trent is the Deputy Assistant Director of Stakeholder Engagement Division at CISA. And in that capacity, he is coordinating strategic partnerships against public and private sectors, institutions in the international and U.S. community. He also oversees partner coordination and information sharing to support the security and resilience of critical infrastructure against hazards, which include terrorism, natural disasters, and cyber attacks. In addition to directing a large and diverse team of professionals, Trent represents CISA often at engagements with senior department leadership, the administration, and before Congress. We're accompanied by his colleague from CISA, Beth Mitchell. Beth is a grant operations branch chief at CISA, and there she specializes in federal financial assistance for state, local, tribal, and territorial public safety partners. Beth also has extensive experience in developing, managing, and administering grant programs, as well as experience managing personnel, systems, contracts. Beth also was previously a supervisory program manager at CISA, and prior to that, she was a program analyst at FEMA. We're also joined by one of our expert partners from the e311 program, EY. Chris Terry is a senior manager in the EY U.S. Insurance and Federal Claims Services practice at his firm. Chris has supported federal cybersecurity grant recipients and subrecipients with eligibility considerations, program design, and ongoing support for program funding. Chris has also worked with hundreds of federal disaster grant recipients and subrecipients, helping them recover over $20 billion in costs from catastrophic events. He has a broad array of experience assisting governments with financial oversight in programmatic areas, including grants management, procurement, monitoring, program assessments, disaster closeout, document requirements, audit resolution, appeals, and a wide range of other services pertaining to large-scale federal disaster grants. The Global Cyber Alliance is a nonprofit organization that was created in 2015 and is dedicated to reducing cyber risks. As a 501c3, it helps build practical, measurable solutions and tools that are easy to use and works with partners, including cities and other NGOs, business leaders, to accelerate the adoption of those tools and solutions around the world at no cost. Many of the executive staff at Global Cyber Alliance have worked with in different government jobs at different levels, and therefore they are familiar with the risks and challenges that your cities face. With us from GCA today on our panel is Chris Apple, who has over 30 years of technical leadership experience and is currently GCA's Cybersecurity Solutions product manager. He is responsible for curating and building cyber tools to meet the needs of various constituent groups, including journalists, NGOs, government entities, election officials, and organizations in the financial services, healthcare, and education sectors. Chris is also leading a global cyber defense initiative that is bringing awareness, skills, and tools to this issue around the world. Chris has held cybersecurity executive level, CISO level roles with Procter & Gamble, EY, GlaxoSmithKline, and he did R&D for AT&T. And so with that, let's go to the next slide. And just framing what these panelists are going to be discussing is the money in the bipartisan infrastructure law that was created for addressing cybersecurity issues. And so with the deep bench that we have on this panel and with our wonderful colleagues from CISA, let's turn to the next slide, top of the agenda. And with that, turn it over to Trent Frazier from CISA. Trent, Zoom is yours.
Thank you so much, and appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today and for this exciting opportunity to meet with your membership and hopefully answer any questions as we're updating on the recent release of the state and local cybersecurity grant program. If I could just the next slide for me. So as mentioned, we wanted to give an overview of the state and local cybersecurity grant program. This program was created under the IIJA and really was designed after consultations and engagements that we've been conducting with our SLTT partners from over the last year. Now, as mentioned, this is the state and local cybersecurity grant program. There will be a separate program that is currently under consultation with federally recognized tribes that is specific for our tribal partners, and we plan to have that notice of funding opportunity released upon completion of that federal consultation period, which is currently active and underway. So most of what we'll talk about today is specific to states, territories, and the local communities within. There is a separate program under development for federally recognized tribes. Next slide. So just a brief overview, this program is a joint partnership between CISA and the Federal Emergency Management Agency. We, CISA, are responsible for program management and for providing the appropriate subject matter expertise for the design and execution of the cybersecurity grant. FEMA, of course, will assume the responsibility for grant administration in keeping with their broader role administering grants on behalf of the Department of Homeland Security writ large. And so we are working very closely with our partners within FEMA and welcome any opportunity to answer any questions that you may have for either agency as part of the discussion. Next slide. So just as an overview, and there's a lot to unpack here. I'll try to make this fairly concrete for you. The program, as funded under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, is about $1 billion divided up over a 4-year period. And you'll see in the bottom right corner there a delineation of how those funds were actually divided up by Congress over that 4-year lifespan. Starting with a $200 million allocation this year, growing to $400 million in fiscal year 23, and then beginning to subside to $300 million and finally $100 million. The program, as appropriated, is a division of labor between CISA and FEMA, as mentioned, CISA being that program management organization and subject matter expert. The program is an allocation formula-based program, and that means it uses a baseline allocation across all 56 states, territories, and the District of Columbia, with additional allocations set aside specifically based on a population-based allocation formula. And that formula is incorporated as part of the notice of funding opportunity, and you'll see within that a breakout of the allocations across the states and territories. Now, of course, within that, there is a requirement that 80% of those funds must be provided to local entities, and 25% of those funds specifically should be provided to rural entities within the states and territories. And of course, in keeping with similar programs within the Department of Homeland Security, there is a cost share component that starts at 90% federal, 10% recipient, and grows in year 4 to a 60% federal, 40% recipient. And there are, of course, within that, specific authorities that allow us to waive that cost share upon request by the recipient. That process for waiver request is articulated as part of the notice of funding opportunity. Now, as you may have gleaned from the early part of this discussion, eligible entities are defined under the law as states and territories, who are then authorized to make sub-awards to communities or local entities within their jurisdictions. So from the standpoint of the grant program itself, the eligible initial recipients are the states and territories. They are then required to make the appropriate planning submissions back to us as part of their application, and then ultimately to identify who the subrecipients will be within their respective jurisdictions. And as I mentioned at the outset, there is a tribal component to this program as well that is currently under development and will be released later this year or early in calendar year 23. Now, just at the high level, the law does allow for multi-entity grants that can be used across jurisdictions. That doesn't mean that there is an additional allocation for multi-entity grants. It simply means that multiple entities can pair together or partner together in the execution of their cyber mitigation projects or other related activities under the program. It does require that the funds be used to develop or revise a jurisdictional level cybersecurity plan, that is a state or territorial level cybersecurity plan. It also requires that those funds can be used for the implementation of the cybersecurity plan as developed, which would include specific projects or mitigations identified within the planning process. Now, it authorizes up to 5% of the fund be retained for purposes of administration of the grants. And of course, there are two additional provisions that allow for the Secretary of Homeland Security to identify additional uses of the grants based on imminent cybersecurity threats or other appropriate activities as identified through the CISA director. We're not currently exploring opportunities to employ those two additional provisions, as we believe that there are sufficient opportunity to execute on requirements specific to the current cybersecurity planning activities. I can see there are some questions in the chat, and but I can't actually see the chat, so I will make sure that as we're going along to answer the chat as we can. But I believe one of the questions was what definition of rural does the grant use? That's actually clarified in the notice of funding opportunity. It's also, you'll find that information on our frequently asked questions page, that is cisa.gov/cybergrant. And we'll make sure that information is provided to you, but you'll see we actually base it on some statutory language that was incorporated specifically under the definitions for the IIJA itself. Next slide, please. So to ensure that the program is addressing systemic cyber risk, but also to ensure that our states, territories, and communities have sufficient flexibility to address those unique threats or challenges that they're confronting locally, we designed the program not with a specific set of overarching mitigations, but instead around 4 specific objectives. And those objectives are designed to guide the process that states, territories, and communities use to develop their cybersecurity plans, but to ensure that those plans address specific practices that are recognized across industry. The first objective, of course, has to do with how governance and planning is accomplished within these jurisdictions. That includes everything from the implementation of the NIST framework and several other industry recognized frameworks, to how states, territories, and communities are coordinating with one another during actual incidents to respond and ultimately recover to those incidents. So it's a key use of that specific objective is ensuring that states, territories, and communities have all of the appropriate governance frameworks in place to effectively manage risk and address incidents as they arise. The second objective is to ensure that states, territories, and communities are effectively engaged in continuous assessment and evaluation. And in fact, this objective is critical as it is the basis for the development of that cybersecurity plan. We want to ensure that folks are taking the time to effectively address where they have critical vulnerabilities or capability gaps in the design of that plan, and then making the appropriate decisions about how to prioritize the use of those funds. That then leads into the third objective, which is really the meat of the plan, and that is the identification and prioritization of mitigations that the states, territories, and those subrecipients would execute to ultimately address the capability gaps or vulnerabilities that they've identified through that assessment and evaluation process. And finally, under Objective 4, of course, there are opportunities for states, territories, and subrecipients in the local communities to utilize these resources for development of cybersecurity workforces. Now, you'll find a lot of in-depth information about those specific objectives built into the Notice of Funding Opportunity, and again, of course, as part of the frequently answered questions page at cisa.gov. Next slide for me. So 2 key components to the implementation of the program. The law does require that recipients, that is states and territories, establish jurisdictional level planning committees. These planning committees are responsible for developing, implementing, and ultimately revising those cybersecurity plans. They're also responsible for approving those cybersecurity plans before those plans can be submitted to us at CISA and FEMA for final review. And of course, they, as part of that process, are responsible for assisting in the determination of effective funding priorities, that is, those individual projects. So from the outset, one of the things I'd like to emphasize, especially for the folks participating today, is that if you are a member of a local community jurisdiction or public entity within a state or territory, these planning committees are a critical access point for how to utilize and gain access to these funds. CISA and FEMA are not allocating the funds to cities or municipalities or local jurisdictions. The funds are directly awarded to the states and territories, and these planning committees are the vehicle for determining how those funds are executed within and across the states and territorial jurisdictions. Now, those planning committees do have legally required membership specifications, including some representation of the eligible entity, that is the state and territory state administrative agency. They also have to include a representative of the state CIO or CISO or their equivalent. They have to include appropriate representation of local jurisdictions within the eligible entity, if the eligible entity is a state. And those local jurisdictions should represent a broad diversity that's indicative of the broad diversity of densities, that is population densities across the state. Now, the law did specifically call out two sectors that have to be represented, including public education and public health. And of course, all members, at least 50% of those members, should have professional expertise relating to cybersecurity or information technology. And again, the intent is that these planning committees are really the vehicle for assessing how best to utilize the funds allocated under this program at the jurisdictional level, the state or territory level. Now, at the completion of that process, the states and territories have to submit a cybersecurity plan that must address 16 cyber-specific elements prescribed under the law, and should also include a breakout and delineation of those mitigation projects or measures they plan to implement utilizing the funding provided under this program. They also have to provide a description of the various roles for implementing that plan across the states, territories, and local jurisdictions, and as mentioned, an assessment of their capabilities against those aforementioned cyber-specific elements, along with the resources and timeline necessary to actually execute on that plan, and appropriate measures to demonstrate how the plan is ultimately improving cyber resiliency across that jurisdiction. Next slide for me. So as mentioned at the outset, the notice of funding opportunity is actually live. It was released on Friday, September 16th with a 60-day window for applications. That includes, that notice of funding opportunity includes the detailed allocations for all 56 states, territories, and the District of Columbia. It also reflects that 60-day application period, which closes on November 15th. Now, one key message that I want to make sure that everyone takes away from the discussion is the application period does not apply to the submission of that cybersecurity plan. It is specifically for the application that the states and territories submit to FEMA, basically to denote that they plan to accept those funds within their jurisdiction. So it is their way of notifying us that they would like to be awarded their grant, their allocated grant under the formula, and then we would make that award not later than December 31st of this year. However, that award will include an administrative hold on the exercise of those funds. And the intent of that administrative hold is to ensure that the planning committees have the opportunity to develop completed cybersecurity plans that are then submitted back to us for final review before the administrative hold is lifted. So for folks on the call today who may be concerned that they don't have really an opportunity to engage with those planning committees, the deadline for applications does not apply to the submission of those cybersecurity plans. The states and territories have until September 30th of next calendar year to actually submit those cybersecurity plans, although we hope that they will submit them earlier than that to ensure that we can move out on the execution of those funds. And as I mentioned at the outset, tribal consultation continues for the tribal component of this program. That tribal cybersecurity notice funding opportunity will be released at a later date. I would mention, though, that federally recognized tribes are eligible to submit as subrecipients to the state and territorial program. So they can be considered local jurisdictions for the purposes of the cybersecurity plan that states and territories develop and submit. Next slide for me. And just as an overview of some key next steps, as mentioned, eligible entities can engage with CISA staff on any programmatic questions, and certainly with FEMA staff for any administrative questions. You'll find we have a number of points of contact that are actively monitoring both of these email boxes. For CISA, it's slcgpinfo@cisa.dhs.gov. For FEMA, it is askcsid or askcsid@fema.dhs.gov if you have any questions and would like for a member of our staff to reach out to you directly. You can also find on the CISA webpage, that is www.cisa.gov/cybergrants, a regularly updated set of information, including frequently asked questions. Those frequently asked questions are updated based on the inputs and questions we're receiving from states, territories, and local jurisdictions on a regular basis. So anytime we receive a question, we will make sure to update those FAQs at least weekly as we're receiving those requests for information to ensure that all the potential eligible recipients and subrecipients have access to that same information and clarifying any questions they may have. Now, during the application development process, the state administrative agencies should identify members of their statewide cybersecurity planning committees in accordance with the notice funding opportunity requirements and begin developing that statewide cybersecurity plan. And I will note that as part of that application process, the states and territories are required to provide us with a roster of those cybersecurity planning committees so that we ensure that they are compliant with the requirements as specified under the law. So this is the opportunity to really be reaching out and making sure that your voices are at the table in that process as these states and territories are making the determination for the membership of those planning bodies. Eligible entities should, of course, reach out to the CISA regional staff for any assistance that they require in establishing those committees. And you'll find on our website information and points of contact for all 10 of our regional offices, including our state cyber coordinators and state cybersecurity advisors. Next slide for me. And this is a nice overview and breakdown of those 10 regions and the states that they are overseeing. And if you have any questions and would like to follow up with any of our regional offices, please don't hesitate to reach out to us or to use the information available to us on our website. We'll also provide information back to the sponsors for today's event to ensure that you have ready access to any of our regional personnel and can engage them directly as you're developing those cybersecurity plans, and certainly as you're considering potential mitigations to identify threats and vulnerabilities. Next slide. And with that, I will pause briefly and hopefully be able to answer any questions if I may. I see there's a lot happening in the chat, but I wasn't able to see the chat. So if I can answer any questions, please let me know.
Trent, I think you covered the one question to you that went into the chat. The rest of the material has been just links that we're sharing in real time to the materials that you are discussing. So in addition, we can have a robust QA at the end of the other speakers as well. But if anybody wants to jump in and has a question for Trent now, by all means, we can do that. Otherwise, we can transition to Chris Terry from EY, who's going to discuss the funding further and what's happening in several jurisdictions.
Thanks, Rose. Good afternoon. My name is Chris Terry. I'm a senior manager with Ernst Young. For this portion of the presentation, we're going to go over some of the specific programs funded under the IIJA or Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. We'll talk about some other programs that have eligible expenses related to cybersecurity components. We're going to talk through key activities to optimize funding and then put a spotlight on some best practices for pursuing cyber dollars. The IIJA authorized a historic $1.2 trillion of funding to states, territories, tribes, and localities to address pressing cyber infrastructure needs with substantial attention to broadband expansion and cybersecurity concerns. And to that end, appropriated $2 billion over the next several years to cybersecurity programs specifically. The breakdown of that $2 billion for cybersecurity authorized by the IIJA includes grants to improve cybersecurity architecture for state and local. The first, as we learned from the previous discussion by CISA, funding can be used to implement, under the state and local cybersecurity grant program, funding can be used to implement cybersecurity projects, address imminent cybersecurity threats, and prepare cybersecurity plans. Moving down the line here, another substantial portion of the $2 billion allocated for cyber-specific programs goes to the Rural and Municipal Utility Advanced Cybersecurity Grant and Technical Assistance Program. The IIJA established this $250 million program to provide grants and technical assistance to deploy advanced cyber technologies for electric grid utility systems. Under this program, eligible entities do include municipally owned electric utilities. Moving on to the next big one, the Cybersecurity for Energy Sector Research, Development, and Demonstration Program. This program intends to develop advanced cybersecurity applications and technologies for use in the energy sector. Again, eligible recipients under this program do include municipally owned electric utilities. And finally, the last one we'll cover on this slide is the Cyber Response and Recovery Fund. This new program allocates $100 million over 5 years to establish a fund that CISA can tap into in the event of a significant cyber incident when other resources are deemed inefficient. Next slide. The IIJA also includes several programs across a range of agencies. While not infrastructure focused, allow for investment in cybersecurity measures as an eligible use to support program objectives. A number of these programs are outlined below. The first, which I assume most folks are familiar with, is the BEAT program, or Broadband Equity and Access Deployment Program. This is really the centerpiece broadband program in the IIJA, which provides funding to expand high-speed internet access and use with a focus on reaching unserved and underserved communities across the US. The next two programs are implemented by the EPA. They allocate just under $12 billion each to provide communities with low-cost financing for a wide range of water quality infrastructure projects, which include conducting cybersecurity assessments. Finally, the Port Infrastructure Development Grant Program provides competitive grants to ports and port authorities to invest in the modernization and expansion of US ports, which includes activities to ensure the cybersecurity of information technology and operational technology of port systems. When pursuing federal dollars for cybersecurity, there are a number of key activities that any organization can perform to optimize funding. The first, and specifically, with the cybersecurity grant program, you want to contact your state administrative agency, or SAA, and statewide cybersecurity planning committee directly to offer input to your state's cyber plan. I think a full list of SAAs will be posted in the chat, but they will also be available or linked to this presentation. Next activity is to really understand the policy areas of emphasis. So number one, developing a holistic approach to the cybersecurity plan, target focus investments which are sustainable over time, establish strong planning committees, and support the state's role as a leader and service provider. A few more activities to optimize funding, specifically when pursuing cybersecurity dollars for mitigation measures. Keep in mind the following considerations: implementing multi-factor authentication, implementing enhanced logging, data encryption for data at rest and in transit, end-of-life software and hardware that are accessible from the internet, prohibit use of known fixed default passwords and credentials, ensure the ability to reconstitute systems, i.e. backups, and finally, migration to the .gov domain. Moving forward, probably the most important activity to optimize funding is really understanding what other state, local, tribal, and territorial governments are doing to prepare. We'll cover some of that on the next slide. And then finally, consider becoming members of the MS-ISAC for access to numerous free cybersecurity resources. And I think we'll post a link in the chat as well. Focusing in on the state of New Mexico for a second, Governor Grisham of New Mexico recently established a cybersecurity planning committee to guide New Mexico's initiatives to protect the state's information security and privacy. The committee intends to perform the following functions. One is to plan and develop a robust cyber infrastructure to address risks and threats to information systems owned by state and local governments. And the second is to advise the governor regarding necessary cybersecurity legislation and support applications to receive federal funding to address cyber needs and challenges. The committee is going to be made up of various cybersecurity professionals from state agencies, school districts, counties, cities, and tribal governments. As cities should be coordinating with cyber planning committees and the state CISO directly to offer assistance in providing input to the statewide cyber plan. Cities should also consider participating on the planning committee themselves.
And Trent, that's an example of what you had been referring to with respect to the planning committees, correct?
Well, that's correct. I mean, ideally, our local jurisdictions are going to be actively engaged either directly or indirectly through representation on these cybersecurity planning committees to ensure that their voices are being heard as part of this process.
Great. And now focusing in on Texas, the state of Texas recently received a $200 million allocation through the American Rescue Plan Act for cybersecurity modernization. Under this program, the grant recipients in Texas fared best in securing the federal funding when they coordinated expeditiously in preparing detailed applications, budget estimates, and project scope. Some of the lessons learned here were, we noticed that subrecipients are through the program fared best when they provided detailed project scopes that aligned to the program areas of emphasis, when they were able to put together a detailed budget, which included itemization of capital versus operational costs, coordinating with other cities and counties to form a multi-group project, factoring in sustainability considerations, and then finally, coordinating multiple funding sources and keeping in mind supplantation restrictions.
Chris, thank you very much. And as Laura Waxman said at the top of the program, we are so pleased to have Mayor Sheehan from Albany, New York here with us. She is doing an absolutely fantastic job in the city of Albany on so many different fronts, and had the experience several years ago of having to deal with a cyber attack that hit her city. And we can't thank her enough for sharing that experience with us and what she did and what the city did in order to respond. Mayor?
Thank you so much. And yes, we were hit by a cyber attack in April of 2019. Fortunately, our CTO recognized that something was amiss. They started this attack on a Friday after City Hall had closed, which is, I guess, a fairly typical MO. And this was an attack that involved encrypting our files. He was able to get an alert and see that something was going on and was able to disconnect from the internet and stop the attack. But unfortunately, a number of our files were encrypted. They demanded a ransom. We did not pay that ransom. And the reason we didn't have to pay the ransom is that we immediately had on-site help from our state ITS services as well as the FBI so that we could assess the damage. We called in all of our directors and commissioners, did a very thorough but quick analysis of what had happened to our data, whether any of the data could be recreated, and to determine just how serious the attack was. We were able, because so many of our databases were backed up off-site, to make the determination that there wasn't anything that couldn't, if it was encrypted, that couldn't be recreated. And so we made that decision over a very short period of time. By Monday at noon, we were open for business. And the only reason that we didn't open as we normally would at 8:30 in the morning is that we wanted to get with each of our employees who have desktops to run them through some security protocols. So we were fortunate in that attack, but one of the things that, I learned a number of things, but I think that, the most important things that we learn, and I think the most important thing for local governments is the importance of offsite data backups. And so as we think about this funding and the funding opportunities, that's certainly top of mind for us because it can be expensive. And we work with other local governments. The cooperation and collaboration that you heard about is really important. And so we collaborate with our county and we share offsite facilities. And it's really important as we think about that security to, our IT director talks about the rule of three copies of your data, that you store 2 copies, backup copies on different storage media, with one of them being off-site. But I will say one of the things that we learned is that, and I'm sure this is true in all of your cities, is that there are people using software for very specific things. It might be an off-the-shelf program that is used to operate some system that your Department of General Services operates. It's really important. And one of the things that we did after our cyber attack was we realized we weren't backing up off-site all of the critical databases, in part because our IT department didn't know the business functions of these systems well enough to understand that it was important to back those up off-site. So I think another really important thing to ensure that you're building into your planning is that business impact analysis. And it's a time-consuming process but it is worth investing in so that you have an understanding of what those systems are, what they do, what they store, how they store it, and whether or not it is something that needs to be backed up at an off-site location. And so we took a very deep dive after our cyber attack to ensure that we had a better understanding of our systems. We also obviously implemented an email security solution. Between 75% and 90% of targeted cyber attacks start with an email. And so it's really important to have in place a really robust, not only security system, but also constantly making sure that your users are practicing good email hygiene. I think we have a particularly cruel CTO. When he tests us, it's usually with a really tempting tagline, like the mayor just granted everyone 2 extra vacation days, kind of irresistible, and people want to open that up. So, but it's important that we do that because it is important to have that good hygiene. The other thing that we all know is that whatever we do, it's not going to be enough. Whatever you invest in, someone's going to tell you that you need something else. There are always new security solutions that come online. And since most of us have limited resources, I think, again, ensuring that you're focused on what are my backup protocols and what is my email and my user hygiene like in my organization, and ensure that those are in place and that you're investing in that. And I think one of the things that's unique to the city of Albany is that we recognize that we couldn't do this alone, and we're fortunate that our governor recognized that we couldn't do it alone either. And so in February, she announced the formation of a joint security operations center to oversee cybersecurity across the state. And she invited the 6 largest cities outside of New York City to participate in this New York JSOC. And it really is a data sharing and cyber coordination across the state and New York City. As I said, we would never have been able to afford or invest at the level that the state is investing in this center. It is headquartered in Brooklyn. It's staffed by both physical and virtual participants, and it really allows us to improve our defenses by seeing very early on the types of attacks that are occurring and what we need to be doing. Because, you know, quite candidly, if somebody's trying to, you know, hit the city of Albany, they're probably doing the same thing to Rochester, to Syracuse, to Utica. So, you know, we're able to get insight into what is happening. And that has been a really important resource. I know that our CTO cannot say enough about how much this is saving us both financially, but also from a peace of mind standpoint with respect to that coordination and that cooperation. So, you know, I don't ever want to have to go through it again. When I went to mayor school, they did not teach us about ransom, and they didn't tell me that I'd have to be deciding whether or not we were going to be sending cryptocurrency to someone somewhere in the world to get our data back. Fortunately, we did not have to do that. I would say that the FBI was phenomenal, but the person who came to help us was literally right out of central casting. I unlocked the door to City Hall on a Saturday afternoon, and there was a person standing there who looked younger than my then 18-year-old son, wearing a Captain America t-shirt, but he was there to save the day and was able to help us through that. And, you know, passwords are at the heart of most successful security attacks. So also, as you're thinking about those investments, we are in the process of going passwordless. So that's the future of authentication. And I think this is a good time for this funding to be available, because for a lot of municipalities who haven't been able to invest, you're going to be able to invest in the most state-of-the-art and benefit from what has happened in the past and what we've learned from those attacks to really secure your data and your residents' data. Thank you.
Mayor, I can't thank you enough for joining our program today and sharing from your insider perspective what happened and some of the solutions that you've applied. So thank you so much. And if anybody has questions for the mayor, kindly put them in the chat and we'll take them as we go along. But to continue the conversation about cyber risks and vulnerabilities and what cities can do to build up their defenses and to mitigate risks, we're going to turn it over now to GCA's Chris Apple. Chris?
Yes, thank you very much. So good afternoon. Because of my experience, I actually know personally what it's like to wear a target on your back that grows larger, heavier, and even more unwieldy every day. So I won't walk through all the details on every slide, but what I would like to point out about the first slide is the title actually captures your collective plight pretty well. Your organizations are highly valued targets, and that is not going to change anytime soon. As you can see from the first three headlines, there's already dozens of examples out there where cities and local governments have fallen prey to cyber criminals. And what you'll notice is I'll focus on examples throughout the presentation rather than walking through all the details. It's important to understand those are a matter of public record. And it's also important to understand that some workshop attendees may represent cities where these actual attacks or even similar attacks have happened. So the last headline is actually very new. It was just published in the last 12 days. So what this means, because NVIDIA has released a brand new, really high performance graphic performance unit, graphical processing unit, GPU card, cyber criminals can invest about $15,000. It's a drop in the bucket for them and a little time, which they're all paid for, to build a password cracking rig that can bust apart a complex 8-character password in less than an hour and even simpler passwords in milliseconds. So what this means is, as you just heard from the prior speaker, we have to re-examine our use of MFA and user security awareness training and testing. It's also noteworthy that you can actually be denied cybersecurity coverage these days if you aren't using MFA. So when we're discussing these federal cybersecurity funding availability today, it actually allows you to strengthen your defenses, such as re-examining those MFA approaches, and hopefully prevent attacks that lead to steep financial loss and even deprivation of critical services like 911 call centers, electric grids, other kinds of public utilities, traffic signals, hospitals, et cetera. And here's the first example. In Baltimore, Maryland, They suffered a ransomware attack that disrupted their 911 dispatch system for about 17 hours with a recovery cost of about $18 million. So imagine waking up one day and realizing that's what you have to go find in your budget to cover somewhere. So next slide. So it's really essential for you to answer the types of questions that you're going to see on this and other slides to identify the gaps and vulnerabilities in your jurisdiction. And the reason is that those are part and parcel of the funding that you're going to seek. So I'm not suggesting you absorb the effort to conduct a deep dive cybersecurity maturity assessment before you even form a planning committee. But if you've recently completed one of those, you should consider using the output to inform both your application and the initial topics that the planning committee is going to address. What I found in my own prior CISO level role is the periodic self-assessments, which have also been described so far by other speakers, based on questions like these included in this presentation, they actually made me more successful in securing the funding needed to prevent problems. And that then enabled me to avoid canceling major improvement initiatives, or even worse, reducing operating budgets to cover those unexpected recovery costs. So here's another couple of examples about why these are the right types of questions to ask. There was an attack that struck Atlanta, Georgia City's computer networks that shuttered municipal courts and left residents unable to access service like its traffic tickets or water bill payment systems. And then similarly, in New Orleans, they declared a state of emergency and launched an investigation after the police department noticed strange activity on some of its computers early one morning. And by lunch, they had disconnected most of their computers and shut down the city's website to insulate department data. Next slide. So there's some reminders here, and I'm mostly going to talk about examples. So rather than walking through each of these questions, again, they fall into the same category as the other types of questions here. They're good ones to try to ask yourself from periodically. So the first example is a social media account belonging to the city of Wichita was hacked in July 2022 by someone appearing to be from Turkey. It should be noted that they were using MFA, and they did report frequent password changes. But at the time of the attack, the affected account had 22,000 followers. Obviously, this is a compromised password for a social media account. But the real risk here is not just the password. It's that it's a high risk of constituent smishing, and all the fraud channels that opens up are what you're going to need to deal with after the attack has happened. So the other one's a compound example because they're both ransomware attacks. So Quincy, Illinois, and Somerset, New Jersey were both hit in May 2022. For Quincy, it was reported that some departments like fire, police, et cetera, had email and phone service affected. And in Somerset County, the impact appears to have been limited to email. This is just about disruption of public safety services, so not something that you want to happen. Then in Wheatridge, Colorado, they were forced to shut down City Hall for over 1 week due to a ransomware attack with a demanded payoff of $5 million. The city actually said no. However, what was reported was that it took 3 weeks from the actual attack date in August of 2022 for Wheatridge to determine that it had adequate redundancies and also then know how to put its databases and systems back into operation. So they were able to say no, just similar to the prior example that you heard, but they did acknowledge they had some challenges with their own recovery procedures that really slowed down the recovery of all of their services. So they're based on electronic records and systems as opposed to what they likely had to do, which were revert to paper processes. So thank you very much.
Chris, thank you so much. And as you can see, we have posted in one slide here the high-end resources and links that have been cited today by CISA, EY, GCA, although my fabulous colleague Jamie Lavin has been popping others into the chat. We'll pull them all together and make sure that they get circulated in addition to these. So we have time for some questions if anybody has any now for the panel. We can stay behind for a bit and take any questions. We also, I know, had a couple that were submitted to us in advance, so I can ask either Hallie or Jamie to put those forth as well.
One question that we received from one of the mayors was about how local governments should be approaching this opportunity. They're not able to be direct applicants. And so how do they keep in touch with their state agencies regarding the cybersecurity plan drafting and the stage of progress?
That's a good question. I mean, there's two ways. One is, I mean, obviously the state administrative agency and the state CIOs are charged with leading up on those planning committees. So we strongly encourage our local governments to be in regular communication with both the state administrative agency and the state CIO or CISO in terms of the development of those plans. The other, and sometimes goes overlooked, is that in many cases, if you have local chapters for community-led organizations, whether it is similar to the National Association of Counties or that type of thing, you'll find that many of those folks are also actively engaging with those planning committees, and it's important for you to be working in close coordination there as well. I think the intent of the planning committees is to have appropriate representative membership from across communities and densities within the jurisdiction. So strongly encourage folks to sort of be working together as you're approaching and working with the state level CIOs and the SAAs in the establishment of those planning committees to make sure that you're not only are your voices heard, but frankly, so that you understand who the representation will be on each.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to launch a poll for everyone while we ask our next question. And I think we've received a question from Dave Prowak. He was talking about the November 15th deadline for each entity to apply to accept the funds from this program. In this case, the entity is the state, correct?
That's correct. It would be the state or territory or the District of Columbia for those purposes. So it's the 56 states, territories, and the District of Columbia.
Great. And then we also heard a question, and this one can be for any of our experts on what are the best short-term ways to minimize the likelihood of a ransomware attack?
Actually, and just as a note, you'll find CISA actually has a website that we've recently created called stopransomware.gov, and you'll find actually a number of best practices, both short-term and contextually longer-term activities you can be doing on that site. One of the most immediate things is, of course, just the basic cyber hygiene steps. In most cases, what we find is for organizations and entities to take all the appropriate basic steps to protect their networks. That includes ensuring that your employees are regularly updating their passwords with robust passwords. If you have the ability to implement multi-factor authentication, of course, ensuring that folks understand not to click a link that they may have received by text, by email, or by internet access. But basic cyber hygiene goes a long way, and in fact, in many cases, a lot of the instances where we're finding actual intrusions for ransomware, a lot of those intrusions are not sort of highly complicated attacks wrought by complex actors. They are in many cases attacks that were utilizing the most basic behavioral techniques to gain access to a network and then implement accordingly.
Yeah, let me just add also, if you're using unvalidated USB drives on your network in any way, that is a significant attack vector still. All of the comments that were just made are applicable. And some of the key questions that are included in the slides from the GCA person's presentation are exactly some of the ones you should be asking yourself at a high level. To say, are my backups managed as they should be? Am I actually managing my passwords the way that I should be? Am I using MFA in all the right places? Does everyone who needs remote access have it and not the other way around? Right. So look at those questions. They're basic ones. Obviously, if there's any follow-up questions, even after this meeting, feel free to reach out, and Bloomberg can get in touch with us.
Great, Chris, thank you so much for that. And we just want to be sensitive to everybody's time. And the opportunity to ask questions is, as Chris indicated, ongoing. So please get in touch with us through the E311 portal that is on the resource slide that we circulated and that we will provide you in the aftermath, and the other websites that have been provided by our speakers. So I want to, before turning it over to Jamie for any additional announcements that she might have about the program, I want to just personally thank all of the speakers who put such tremendous work into this program today at EY, at GCA, and we really value the time that CISA took to prepare this presentation and to spend with us today. We know how very busy you are. We can't thank you enough. Laura and Dave, as always, thank you for your valuable collaboration from the U.S. Conference of Mayors. And Kobri and Kim, let me just say thank you so much for pulling everything together from everyone to make this such a wonderful, deep conversation and presentation. And so with that, Jamie, I'll turn it over to you for any final announcements.
Great. Thank you so much, Rose, and thank you to everyone for attending today, and thank you to all of our speakers. Please, we put the links to the program website, the E311 site, and to the local infrastructure hub site in the chat. We'll send those out in our follow-up emails. We'll continue creating programming that's responsive to your needs. So if you have a topic that you're interested in learning more about, please be in touch with us, let us know, and we're happy to work with you to pair you together with an expert to receive some one-on-one guidance or to put together a workshop if we know it's an area of shared concern. And so with that, thank you all and have a very happy Halloween.